The Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and a distribution list dedicated to circulating amendments, exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our markup today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as possible. I would also remind all members that guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician states that face coverings are required for all meetings in enclosed space such as committee hearings. Everybody attending this hearing is required to follow this guidance and will not recognize members to speak who are not in compliance with these rules. If you do not wish to put on a mask, you have the option to participate in this hearing remotely. Finally, I would ask all members, both those present in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 8354, the Service Members and Veterans Initiative Act of 2020, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 8354 to establish the Service Members and Veterans Initiative within...
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. I call on all my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 8354, the Service Members and Veterans Initiative Act of 2020, a bipartisan bill that would permanently establish a Service Members and Veterans Initiative within the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Launched on December 2014, the Service Members and Veterans Initiative, or SVI, has been at the forefront of the Department of Justice's efforts to protect service members, veterans, and their families from being victimized in cases of fraud and predatory lending. This legislation builds on the SVI's experience by making it permanent to ensure that the DOJ continues to promote the legal interests of service members, veterans, and their families within the Department of Justice. Most notably, H.R. 8354 would appoint a liaison to the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division to coordinate federal prosecution of cases involving fraud against service members. By giving SVI a permanent home in DOJ's Civil Rights Division, the bill would ensure that DOJ will continue to provide outreach to service members, will provide the Attorney General with policy recommendations on service member-related matters, and will enforce the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act of 1986, and the Service Members Civil Relief Act, among other laws. Coupled with the SVI's current outreach efforts, establishing this direct link to the criminal division will ultimately allow DOJ to be more effective in addressing civil and criminal frauds against service members and their families. Fraud schemes that target service members and their families are especially pernicious. Between 2015 and 2019, the FTC received over 163,000 reports of fraud targeting military retirees and veterans, and nearly 13,000 fraud reports from active duty service members. The FTC ascertained that the median loss in these cases was significantly higher for service members and veterans than for their civilian counterparts. This bill also codifies the Service Members and Veterans Initiative as a section within the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Permanent establishment of the SVI would recognize the important work it has carried out since 2014. The successful legal actions that the SVI has undertaken thus far have returned tens of millions of dollars to service members and their families. H.R. 8354 would bolster these efforts and would ensure that they continue. Our service members and veterans have worked tirelessly to protect us at home and abroad. It is only right that we work as hard as we can to protect them from abuses such as fraud, predatory lending, and other fraudulent schemes. I thank our colleague, Representative Escobar, for her leadership on this issue and for authoring this important legislation. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting the bill today. I now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill codifies important work being done by the Department of Justice. Housed in the Civil Rights Division, the Department's Service Members and Veterans Initiative works on behalf of those who serve and have served our country. The initiative coordinates with the Civil Rights Division and other Department of Justice components to enforce federal law protecting service members, veterans, and their families. The Service Members and Veterans Initiative also provides resources to the public and legal practitioners about federal laws protecting service members, veterans, and their families. During the Trump administration, the Service Members and Veterans Initiative and the Civil Rights Division launched a Veterans Access Initiative to focus on the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is an important tool for ensuring that those veterans who return from service with a disability can effectively reintegrate into civilian life. And although I intend to support this bill, I will just note my general concern regarding legislation, particularly concerning criminal law, that works to treat offenders or victims differently based on their status. And I recognize fully that if we are going to do that, veterans are the best group to do that. However, criminal law should criminalize conduct. Regardless of a particular group's worthiness, we risk unequal application of the law when one group receives unique treatment based on their status. So even with all those concerns, I intend to support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any amendments to H.R. 8354? For what purpose does Ms. Escobar, the author of the bill, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you so much, Chairman Nadler, for bringing up this bill for our consideration. I'd also like to thank my Texas colleague, Representative Van Taylor, for leading this effort with me. I'm very proud of this bipartisan bill that would make the Service Members and Veterans Initiative permanent within the Department of Justice. H.R. 8354 would task certain duties to the DOJ to represent the legal interests of military families and veterans, such as advising the Attorney General on legal matters, developing policy recommendations, serving as the liaison between the DOJ and military departments, and coordinating the prosecution of fraud that targets service members and their families. Fort Bliss is an integral part of my community and my district. It is one of the largest Army installations in the world, training soldiers from every U.S. state and territory. Some decide to stay after their service, growing our 50,000-strong veterans community. This bill would protect these service members and veterans in El Paso and around the world who have sacrificed so much for our country and ensure their interests are prioritized and protected. I have the honor of also serving on the House Armed Services Committee and know some of the challenges the military community faces. For example, I've heard from families about unsafe housing conditions, from mold making families sick to service request orders that remain unfulfilled for weeks. I've also known about financial scams that unfairly target and specifically target military and veterans families. This bill would make it easier for the Department of Justice to coordinate with the Department of Defense to ensure that their needs are met and that they are not taken advantage of. I urge my colleagues to support this important bipartisan bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Steuben seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd be happy to yield to the sponsor. I just had some general questions. I don't know if there's like a reverb or something. I served as a JAG, active duty, for about 3 years. And so obviously a lot of what happens, so looking at paragraph 1, lines 7 to 10, what happens to service members and their families. So you represent Fort Bliss. What happens on Fort Bliss? There's a whole team of JAGs that do this very thing. So my question is like, what is the interplay here between what are the roles of JAGs, because they advise both criminal and civil laws specifically to the service members and their families on these different installations. And even if they're not on installations, when I was in the service, we had JAGs embedded with battalions and brigade combat teams so that if soldiers or service members had issues, whether they were criminal in nature or civil in nature, with that unit, they could go to their JAG and get those answers, those questions answered. So what exactly are we doing here that JAGs don't already do on some of these installations?
Thank you. Do you yield to me?
Yeah, I yield. I'm just trying to have a discussion about what the
Thank
difference
you,
here
Mr.
is.
Stubbe, I appreciate it. So the Department of Justice does civil, these are prosecutions off base. So I'll give you an example of what we have heard about from, in the Military Personnel Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. We have heard from military families, for example, who have housing off base that is steeped in mold, that is dangerous for them to live in. And I do also want to remind you, in addition to what is occurring off base, I want to remind you that this is an initiative that already exists within the Department of Justice. It's something that has existed through, I believe, 3 different presidential administrations. What this bill seeks to do is make permanent an already existing project within the Department of Justice, one that has been successful, but one that has not had a permanent home. And so this would not interfere with the work or overlap with the work that JAGs do, but it would simply codify and make permanent work that the Department of Justice is already doing.
So to the example that you just gave, like the JAGs on the post, if there's issues on off-post housing, obviously they can assist in that. So are these people in DOJ that are part of this organization like assisting the JAGs, or are they taking over on issues as it relates to that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand. I understand that we've had the people that have done this in DOJ, but we also have JAGs that are embedded in installations and with units, and trying to understand the interplay between the two. Is there communication between what we are now creating, this division within DOJ? They're going to work with JAGs on these different installations, or is this completely separate and they're kind of doing their own thing?
So JAGs don't pursue criminal activity against veterans by civilians. So this is separate from what JAGs.
Well, they can if it happens on post. They can.
Right, and this is off post.
Okay. Well, okay. If it's a service member or family and it's criminal, it still would be a JAG even if it happened off post, because the jurisdiction of the service member would be the unit and the commander. So if that individual who serves at Fort Bliss and whatever unit it is committed a criminal violation, they can be charged through the UCMJ, through the military's justice system, which is also federal court. The UCMJ, through those court systems, is federal. I'm running out of time.
That is not my understanding, that JAGs are able to prosecute civilians who commit crimes against veterans.
No, my example was service members who commit crimes, because they're still under the jurisdiction of that unit. If it's a service member and he's in a unit, regardless of whether the crime was committed, they can be charged through the UCMJ, through that unit, and that commander can make a charge based on the UCMJ.
Right, these are civilians who commit, unless I'm completely misunderstanding your question. I'm sorry?
Well, we can, I only have 40 seconds. We can talk offline. I'm not trying to be adversarial. I'm just trying to understand what this does that JAGs don't already do. Because in line 9, it says enforce criminal laws or civil laws that impact service members, veterans, and families. Obviously, veterans wouldn't be necessarily, although they could, if they were retired, have access to JAGs, but certainly service members and families do. So if it's criminal in nature, as in the service member has committed the crime, JAGs would handle that. If it was a crime committed against them on post, JAGs would handle that. If it was a civilian that committed a crime off post and it involved a service member, then that would be the only instance that this would take effect. So I'm just trying to understand the interplay between.
That's precisely part of the gap that the project intended to fill. One that is not codified in law, one that is not permanent, one that has been used by 3 presidential administrations, including this one, that we are trying to make permanent.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. For what purposes, Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my colleague from Texas, Congresswoman Escobar, for putting forth this very important legislation. I think both of us realize that Texas has been cited as a state that has the highest number of veterans. Certainly, we have a very large number of very, very, very large bases. She knows that A number of us on the Judiciary Committee and she on the Armed Services Committee, has been working with the tragedy of Vanessa Guillen. But more importantly, we know of the challenges of service members and veterans. I can't imagine a more important asset to help service members and veterans not be treated unfairly and actually being abused and misused. I can think of many instances of which our office handles casework in the instance of family matters, but also in the instance of school loans that many veterans and service members are taking advantage of and signing up for school loans, purchasing cars, and many elements in the civil proceedings, but as well criminal. I want to specifically take note of the fact of education. And even though there are a myriad of opportunities for our veterans and service members in education outside of the educational process of the military, we know that for-profit schools and other schools giving certificates, giving higher degrees, plague our soldiers and our veterans by enticing them to seek a better life for their families and signing up for these programs where the interest rates are astronomical and they wind up with enormous debt, which keeps them from functioning post-military. In addition, the other aspect is, of course, in housing. I've already heard Congresswoman Escobar indicate situations with bad housing, but it also comes about with apartments and purchase of homes. And so I believe that establishing this SBI and working with the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division and Criminal Division is a very important part of the work that will help these veterans not be alone. I understand the JAG process, and my thought would be, and I heard the discussion, is that where there was a conflict, the two agencies, the military and the particular branch and the DOJ would be able to work out the appropriate lead on the jurisdiction of the question. As I understand, the SBI currently has no formal statutory authorization, so assigning a liaison in SBI to coordinate criminal fraud prosecution is critical in protecting service members. Civil actions initiated by DOJ have not thus far stemmed the rising number of fraud schemes in housing, in particular, that target service members. So criminal prosecutions available under the current fraud statutes will provide a strong deterrent to widespread efforts to defraud service members. We have seen this in our offices. We've tried to stop it case by case, but sometimes it's an enormously sad situation when the meager resources of these either veterans and or service members are taken through fraud in housing, through fraud in going to school, or other purchases that they may be making. So let me support the Service Members and Veterans Initiative Act of 2020, HR 8354, ask my colleagues to support it, and congratulate and thank my colleague from Texas, Congresswoman Escobar, for her great leadership on this issue. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I, too, want to thank my colleague and good friend, Congresswoman Escobar and Congressman Taylor, for bringing this bipartisan legislation to support our service members, our veterans, and their families. And I will tell you the largest casework that I have in my office in the 6th Congressional District in Georgia is for our veterans. So I'm really excited to see continued work and really providing the best means of support and resources for those families. Over the years, Congress has taken very important steps to make sure that service members and veterans can exercise their rights and don't face additional legal problems as a result of their service to this country. We have passed laws that make sure our service members can vote from around the world, wherever they are serving, wherever they're serving our country. And we have laws that protect veterans from fraud. We have laws that protect our veterans and service members as they look for civilian jobs and prohibit discrimination against them in the workplace. But these laws simply don't enforce themselves. Veterans and service members often contact my office for help getting the protections that they have earned through their honorable service. Too often, they haven't been informed of their rights, or they may know their rights, but they simply haven't been able to get the justice that they deserve. It's been so meaningful for me and for my staff to really work on behalf of our veterans community and service member constituents, but we still have so much more work to do. I am proud to support the Service Members and Veterans Initiative Act of 2020 so that the Department of Justice has a permanent initiative to support our service members, our veterans, and their families. They deserve that. I urge my colleagues to stand with me in protecting the rights of those who have served and endured so much on our behalf. Our veterans, service members, and their families who stand beside them deserve better protections and strong enforcement efforts to support them. I yield the balance of my time. I'm so excited to support this legislation.
The gentlelady yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Chairman Nadler, I'd like to request recognition.
And that's Mr. Liu. For what purpose does Mr. Liu seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of this legislation. I previously served on active duty as a JAG, and the way jurisdiction works, first of all, is let's just explain the role of the JAG. We play a critical role in maintaining good order and discipline in the United States military. We prosecute military members. However, we do not court-martial civilians. A JAG does not do that. So you need civilian authorities to do that, either the U.S. Attorney's Office or the local district attorney. So if there is a criminal fraud action that takes place, if there's a violation of the law, if it's a local law or a state law, then the local authorities, the civilians, will do that. If it's a federal law, then the U.S. Attorney's Office does that. In some cases, a JAG can be essentially deputized as a special assistant U.S. attorney, but then they're prosecuting that as an assistant U.S. attorney. So JAGs, in fact, do not court-martial civilians. So there's no conflict in this bill, and I wholeheartedly support the bill. I also do want to take this opportunity to again say how utterly unacceptable it was for the President of the United States to call service members who lost their lives in war losers and suckers. I serve on active duty to defend the right of anyone to make stupid statements. I just never thought it'd be coming from the President of the United States. I urge the President to apologize for those comments. And then today we see an Atlantic article that talks about the President making fun of those of us like me who believe in Christ. He called those who were Christians hustlers. Again, I call on the President to apologize for those remarks as well. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? In that case, the reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 8354 favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no.
Aye.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 7370, the Protecting Employees and Retirees in Business Bankruptcy Act of 2020, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 7370 to amend Title 11, United States Code to improve
Without
protections.
objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 7370, the Protecting Employees and Retirees in Business Bankruptcies Act, would protect the interests of workers and retirees in the Chapter 11 bankruptcy process and would put much-needed limits on excessive executive compensation. As the COVID-19 pandemic has unleashed a record number of corporate bankruptcies, it is more important than ever that we protect vulnerable workers who have faced enormous challenges through this crisis and who continue to face extraordinary uncertainty in our struggling economy. This crisis has laid bare the deep inequalities in our society. Essential workers are forced to risk their health and safety every day, often for the sake of corporate profits. At the same time, our workforce faces record job losses and grossly inadequate unemployment assistance. And unfortunately, corporate bankruptcies can serve as another tool to deprive workers and retirees of their hard-won wages and benefits. Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code is supposed to reflect an equitable compromise between the interests of workers and creditors when a business ends up in bankruptcy. But history has shown that this balance is not reflected in practice. Instead, big corporations often exploit the Chapter 11 process as a business model to enrich wealthy executives using the livelihoods of workers and retirees as leverage. Funds for wages, benefits, and pensions may be drained, while the top brass walk away with millions, often the same people whose decisions led the business to bankruptcy in the first place. Corporate bankruptcies resulting from COVID-19 are following the same familiar pattern. For example, the retailer JCPenney has closed hundreds of stores and cut at least 1,000 jobs since declaring bankruptcy, but has still managed to find $4.5 million to pay its CEO. This kind of blatant injustice is happening across the country and across industries, and it will continue unless we act. We must put an end to these abusive practices and ensure that working people get the fair deal that bankruptcy laws were always supposed to provide them. H.R. 7370, the Protecting Employees and Retirees in Business Bankruptcies Act, is a long overdue commitment to that fair ideal. It improves recoveries for employees and retirees, providing more favorable priority treatment for wages, benefits, and retiree pensions. It also makes it more difficult for employers to reject collective bargaining agreements and reduce employee benefits during reorganization. And it explicitly clarifies that the purpose of Chapter 11 bankruptcy is to preserve jobs to the maximum extent possible. Additionally, H.R. 7370 places a check on executive compensation in bankruptcy, strengthening court requirements for approval of excessive bonuses and other compensation for a business's most highly compensated employees, and it ensures that wealthy executives cannot maintain their own benefit programs if they slash benefits for workers. Over the past several months, we have felt a devastating crisis upend our economy. We have businesses failing at an alarming rate and workers carrying a disproportionate share of the burden. Unfortunately, the corporate bankruptcies resulting from COVID-19 are just deepening this disparity. H.R. 7370 is a comprehensive set of reforms that will protect American workers from corporate abuse when their employer files for bankruptcy, and it will ensure that reality reflects the balance intended by our bankruptcy laws. I thank the Senate sponsored this bicameral bill, Mr. Durbin, as well as Congressman Norcross, who has been a champion of this legislation, and my colleagues on this committee who have joined as co-sponsors. I urge all members to support this important legislation. I now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems like my Democratic colleagues are trying to use the coronavirus pandemic as a pretense for overhauling the Bankruptcy Code in a way that hurts American companies and helps special interests. This bill makes radical changes to the Bankruptcy Code's Chapter 11 reorganization process. Chapter 11 bankruptcy usually involves the structured reorganization of a company's assets and debts in bankruptcy court. H.R. 7370 overinflates labor's immediate interests at the risk of successful reorganization, which will end up hurting workers. Successful reorganizations put business in a position to sustain long-term jobs and benefit for workers and the company. More importantly, the Bankruptcy Code already provides for fair treatment of a number of different types of creditors and interests, including the interests of workers. And current mechanisms in the Bankruptcy Code are effective at protecting workers' interests. No one would deny that preserving jobs and benefits is an important public concern during the bankruptcy process, especially at this time. But elevating a single goal over all others will have unintended and far-reaching consequences. The unfortunate reality is this bill will make Chapter 11 restructuring plans harder to achieve and will force more companies into liquidation. And liquidation is the worst possible outcome for workers. If this committee really wants to help the American worker, we would focus on supporting President Trump's efforts to restart the economy and get our employees back to work. Instead of seriously legislating, the Democrats continue to waste time of this committee on partisan pet projects. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without objection,
7370.
the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment makes one grammatical correction to the findings, but it makes no substantive changes to the bill. I urge members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I rise enthusiastically in supporting 7370, the Protecting Employees and Retirees in Business Bankruptcies Act of 2020. These include a variety of measures to help workers and retirees be treated fairly when their employer declares bankruptcy. Interesting, it seems, that the only people that don't get a fair shake in these bankruptcies are clearly those who have given 10, 20, 30, 40 years of their commitment, their love and affection for their employer. These include protecting employees and retirees' unpaid wages and benefits when a business declares bankruptcy, reducing employees and retirees' losses by strengthening the procedural safeguards that protect collective bargaining agreements and retiree benefits, clarifying that the principal purpose of Chapter 11 bankruptcy is the preservation of jobs to the maximum extent possible, and restricting executive compensation programs for companies in bankruptcy. That probably is the greatest Achilles heels of bankruptcy, that what the resources are used for are the very execs that made the mistakes. In recent decades, headlines have been filled with reports about the collapse and bankruptcy of corporate giants, CIT Group, Chrysler, General Motors, Lehman Brothers, Linens and Things, Delphi Corporation, Delta Airlines, Enron, WorldCom, and more recently, Payless, Shoe Source, Sears, JCPenney, Models, PG&E, and Toys R Us. Stores that we all loved and shopped at in many instances, and corporations that we knew. Once bankruptcy intervenes, workers have to get in line with other unsecured creditors for severance benefits, unused vacation pay, expenses, and commissions, a process that can leave them with mere pennies on the dollars they owed. In contrast, the chief executives of these debtors often receive extravagant bonuses. This is just another example of where the wealthy and well-connected take advantage of the system to their substantial benefit, while ordinary workers get taken advantage of and treated unfairly, kind of like how some officials in high offices could think that paying $750 in their federal income taxes is somehow fair and represents what the hardworking Americans have to do as well. Speaking of Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the inequity of such disparate pay packages is further heightened where the company's financial difficulties stem from bad decisions. This is a very important initiative because what happens is that we provide the kind of leadership and language that protects these workers. Let me indicate that I've had firsthand experience. As I do so, let me make mention of JCPenney forced to temporarily close its 846 department stores, losing 78,000 to 85,000 employees. Hertz terminated more than 41,000 employees, and Whiting Petroleum bestowed $14.6 million in extra compensation to executives. This legislation offers immediate relief from the forces which threaten to destroy the debtor beyond repair. Thus, a critical criterion of Chapter 11 case is finding the appropriate balance between the maximization of a return to creditors and interest holders and the non-liquidating debtor's ability to rehabilitate and consummate the plan. Finally, let me say I lived through this with one of my constituents, Enron, from the very moment of their bankruptcy, and knew the leaders. I know there are people who were good intentions, but overall, they went bankrupt, and all I could see is little boxes coming out in the hands of employees, many of them destroyed, many of them died, many of them losing their homes. I remember being outside of the building, standing with these employees, trying to get relief, trying to see if anyone cared. And we stood with them until we were able to get legislative relief of some form. But this is an important initiative because those who suffer, those who died, those who lose their homes, those who lose everything, as these employees cried and said, we have nothing, absolutely nothing, not even retirement, are those who gave their hard work, their life, their dedication, many of whom have been veterans who served in the United States military. I ask for the support of H.R. 7370 to recognize hardworking Americans. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Lofgren seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I support this legislation, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling it for a hearing. Amidst the wave of corporate bankruptcies triggered by the pandemic and its economic fallout, these changes are very important to ensure that employees and retirees are treated fairly in the bankruptcy process and not sidelined by powerful and well-represented corporate and financial interests. In particular, I think it's correct that the bill raises the bar for companies that want to use bankruptcy to shrink their previous commitments to retired employees. This should only be allowed when and to the extent that it's absolutely necessary. And I would note that over the years, since you and I have been members of the Judiciary Committee, we have seen bankruptcy law increasingly changed to benefit the powerful, the corporations, to the disadvantage of employees and people who don't have that power. This bill would go a long ways in changing that. Now, in addition to these reforms, I want to call attention to another bankruptcy reform that is particularly needed given the current wave of corporate bankruptcies, and that's reform of bankruptcy venue. Current law allows corporations to file for bankruptcy in the state of incorporation instead of the real world locations where their businesses and assets are actually found. This is often in Delaware. The state of incorporation typically has nothing to do with where the corporation is actually based or operating or where employees live. I have a bipartisan bill with my friend Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner that would end this form shopping and require corporations to file in a local bankruptcy court where they're headquartered or where their principal assets are located. Now, it sounds arcane, but it's actually important to workers and retirees and other stakeholders in large corporate bankruptcies. They shouldn't be forced into distant bankruptcy courts in Delaware or elsewhere, which have no real ties to the companies and are distant from the employees and stakeholders who don't have corporate power. This reform would also alleviate the backlog of bankruptcy cases that's developed in Delaware and a couple of other districts. All of these reasons for venue reform are especially pressing now amidst the pandemic wave of corporate bankruptcy. So I strongly support the bill that is before us today, and I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, that we will have a time to take up the bipartisan reform of venue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. McCarcel-Powell seek recognition?
I ask to strike the last word, Mr.
Gentlelady is
Chairman.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to support H.R. 7370, the Protecting Employees and Retirees in Business Bankruptcies Act. I think that we can all agree that we have a problem in this country. We have a problem where certain corporate executives hold themselves above the employees who give their sweat and their time to make businesses and their economy run. We need an economy that works for everyone. That is why bills like these are necessary. When businesses file for bankruptcy, we see executives getting sometimes millions of dollars in bonuses and payouts, but thousands of employees are left behind, most of the time with nothing. And while massive bonuses are given to corporate executives, today our bankruptcy law lets companies seize employees' unpaid wages and retirees' pensions and benefits and give that money to Wall Street creditors. Many of the workers are told that their jobs are not safe, that they're expendable, and many others are simply just laid off. During this pandemic, like the chairman noted, we've seen major businesses file for bankruptcy and the lives of tens of thousands of employees thrown into uncertainty. And this is the reality that so many Americans and so many workers have to live with. Our bankruptcy laws don't protect them to the extent that it should, and it protects the executives and the corporate insiders far more than they should. And who knows this best? Just ask President Donald Trump. Throughout his career, Donald Trump has filed for bankruptcy 6 times. That is 6 times. I just want to make sure that we're clear on that. Donald Trump's gambling and hotel company, let's start there, Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts. Under Donald Trump's leadership, the company lost tens of millions of dollars a year, year after year. Even as it hurtled toward bankruptcy, Donald Trump was paid $1.5 million in salary. He even received a $5 million bonus in the year the company's stock plummeted by 70%. When the company failed and filed its Chapter 11 bankruptcy plan, Trump would keep his job as chairman and receive a $2 million annual salary and a $7.5 million beachfront property in Atlantic City. But what happened to the employees when the company went bankrupt? They suffered the most and lost millions in retirement savings. Most of them were left with nothing, including no health coverage, no health insurance, no pay or pension plans. In his own words, Trump said of the bankruptcy, and I quote, "I don't think it's a failure. I think it's a success," end quote. Corporate executives like Donald Trump are why we need this legislation, to protect the employees and workers who are just trying to make a living, and the retirees who depend on their hard-earned pensions and healthcare to get by, and who actually pay their fair share of taxes. I support this bill. I urge my colleagues to do the same. And Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a Washington Post article dated June 12, 2016, titled, "As its stocks collapsed, Trump's firm gave him huge bonuses and paid off his jet." A New York Times article of June 11, 2016, titled, "How Donald Trump Bankrupted His Atlantic City Casinos, but Still Earned Millions." And another article, Mother Jones article of October 17, 2016, titled, "How Trump's Casinos Bankruptcies Screwed His Workers Out of Millions in Retirement Savings." And I yield back.
Without objection, for what purpose does Mr. Cicilline seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, H.R. 7370, the Protecting Employees and Retirees in Business Bankruptcies Act, is necessary and long overdue legislation that will protect hardworking Americans and retirees in the bankruptcy process. Importantly, this bill would also impose limits on excessive executive compensation in the bankruptcy process to prevent executives at failing firms from cashing out through golden parachutes and other elaborate compensation packages while workers get pink slips. This legislation is long overdue. For decades, big corporations have used the bankruptcy process to slash their employees and retirees' hard-earned pay and benefits while giving their top executives massive bonuses. Just look at some of the biggest bankruptcies this year. JCPenney furloughed 78,000 workers, while the company's top executives took home nearly $10 million in bonuses, including $7.5 million to just 4 executives just before it filed for bankruptcy. In another outrageous example, Hertz fired more than 14,000 workers, but gave its executives $16 million in bonuses, including $1.5 million each to its top 3 executives 3 days before it filed for bankruptcy. And in just the first 6 months of this year, executives at bankrupt companies received $131 million in payouts, according to a report by Bloomberg. All too often, the same firms who have no problem coming up with millions of dollars for their executives just before they file for bankruptcy suddenly can't find the money they owe their employees once the company enters the bankruptcy process. They demand that their employees give up their unpaid wages and slash their health care and retirement plans to the bone. And they do it all with a straight face because they know that bankruptcy process has become a sword for the powerful instead of the shield against the predatory that Congress intended it to serve as. The bankruptcy system is supposed to work for everyone, but right now it doesn't. When a company goes bankrupt, employees and retirees shouldn't be forced to sacrifice more than anyone else, but too often they do. No company should be able to file for bankruptcy to break the deals they've made with their workers, but right now they can. And no executive should receive million-dollar bonuses just days before their company files for bankruptcy, but they do, even today, when nearly 14 million Americans are looking for work. Mr. Chairman, bankruptcy law was never supposed to work this way, and it doesn't have to. That's why I applaud you for introducing H.R. 7370. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor, and it's why I urge my colleagues to support this excellent piece of legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Lesko seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I really find it frustrating that a number of my Democratic colleagues continue to focus on President Trump. Here we are passing legislation, some of it bipartisan, some of it not. Some I agree with, some I don't. But since January of 2019, when the Democrats took over majority in the U.S. House of Representatives, I have sat through meeting after meeting, not only in this committee, but in my other committee, Homeland Security Committee, where nonstop it's just bashing, trashing President Trump. I just listened to people doing it again. And can I just say that we'd probably get a lot more done in a bipartisan fashion if this wasn't constantly what was going on. If we could just pay attention to what the bills are, I would greatly appreciate it. And what was really offensive to me, quite frankly, and I was going to bite my tongue, but I couldn't, is when, Congressman Liu sat there and said that President Trump was against Christians via some Atlantic magazine article, which probably isn't true, by the way, because they're the ones that had the 4 anonymous sources of what Trump supposedly said. In the Prayer March 2020, you had Mike Pence there. President Trump has come to pro-life. I mean, he's backed by most Christian organizations. And to say he's attacking Christians is just totally outrageous. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Jayapal seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When corporations restructure, worker protections should be a top priority, not an afterthought. And that's why I'm very proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Protecting Employees and Retirees and Businesses Bankruptcies Act of 2020. And it's also why I included it as a key component of my bill, the Paycheck Recovery Act. Chairman Nadler, I thank you for your leadership in introducing this bill and moving it forward. It's undeniable that every community in the country is suffering right now due to massive job loss. Since February, nearly 12 million people have lost their jobs. The job market is incredibly tight. Right now, there are 2.5 workers for every 1 job posting. Families who have experienced job losses are going hungry. A full 10% of recently surveyed adults reported that their household did not have enough to eat. And although every community is suffering, the burden is distributed unequally. Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian workers are facing higher levels of unemployment as compared to white workers, are experiencing food insecurity at far higher rates, and have fallen behind on rent due to income loss at much higher levels. And that's why it's so important that this bill contains new job preservation requirements. Bankruptcy courts have incredible power to determine whether and how debtors' property and assets can be sold off. If this act is passed, a bankruptcy court would be required to consider whether potential purchasers would preserve jobs. And at the end of the day, that leaves more people working and all of us better off. This is especially important in this moment as major employers continue to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, including large retail chains like J.Crew, Neiman Marcus, and JCPenney. What's going to happen to all of those workers in big cities and small towns who worked at those stores? With this act, more workers will have a shot at replacing their lost jobs. This bill is also incredibly important for retirees, people who have worked their entire lives for a promise of retirement security and a good life in their golden years. When companies go bankrupt, workers' retirement dreams can be threatened as their retirement packages may be reduced, while many times the CEOs of bankrupt companies get huge payouts. That's just unfair. Executives at major companies, including Chesapeake Energy, JCPenney, Hertz, and Whiting Petroleum, all received major bonuses shortly before filing for bankruptcy. This bill requires that if high-level corporate insiders want to keep their retirement benefits, they have to also ensure that workers who spent their lives bringing benefits to the company are guaranteed retirement security. Let's just be clear, no success at any company is possible without the workers who power those companies. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill, and I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this important legislation before our body today. Our nation is still in the midst of a very serious pandemic, and we're feeling its effects in so many different ways. Nothing is more important than protecting Americans' health and our safety. But we know that the effects of this pandemic are not limited simply to our health. Workers, business owners, and communities are struggling under the economic burden of this pandemic. We must provide businesses the support that they need to weather this economic storm. And if they turn to bankruptcy, we must make sure that workers, retirees, and families are a top priority. Working people continue to be on the front lines to make sure that we all have the resources that we need in this very difficult time. Many have wondered whether their jobs are here to stay, and we owe it to the workers. We owe it to our workers to make sure that when a company turns to bankruptcy, its workers get what they've earned, the income and the benefits that the families are counting on. It's also critical that we protect people's retirement. Older Americans have spent decades saving and planning for their retirement. But they couldn't have planned for this virus, as none of us could have planned for it. Many of our seniors are already facing additional costs from disrupted plans as they do what they can to stay afloat and to stay safe. And we cannot burden them further by suddenly pulling away the retirement benefits that they've earned and that they've come to rely upon. And once again, I'm so pleased to support this legislation and encourage my colleagues to support it as well. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Raskin seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to be heard on your legislation, H.R. 7370, which I support. I plan to vote for, and I'm delighted that you've brought it forward. Our nation was really conceived in revolution against monarchy and royalty and a class of people who's above everybody else. And we have a class of people above everybody else now, the CEOs, who, like Donald Trump, can plunder companies, drive 6 of them into bankruptcy, which is what Donald Trump did, and then make off with millions of dollars in bonuses, while the bargain for consideration of the workers embodied in a collective bargaining agreement, their contract is ripped up by a bunch of bankruptcy judges. So I'm glad that you're starting the process of repairing this, because the bankruptcy laws are plunder of the working people of America. And the CEOs and the ripoff artists, the con men like Donald Trump, can simply get up, dust themselves off, and then go and do it to another company, bankrupt another company, take millions out of that one, and successively go forward and rip off the workers. And it's not fair. It's an absolute violation of the social contract. So personally, I would go further than where your bill goes, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that there should be any rejection of collective bargaining agreements allowed at all. I mean, there was this effort in back, I think it was in 1984, but you can correct me if whenever the last round of amendments were done. But these were, again, trying to rein in bankruptcy courts that were giving everything away to the debtors. That language was written, but that language has been
Mr. Chairman, I have point of order.
totally teased and tortured and reevaluated.
The gentleman will suspend.
Yes.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order, move the gentleman's words be taken down. The gentleman called the president a con man, said the president is a con man. Those words violate the,
If that offends you, I'm happy. If that offends you, I'm happy to withdraw because I think you must have misunderstood what I was saying. I was talking about a class of people who plunder their businesses
Chairman.
and then use the bankruptcy law.
Gentleman has withdrawn his words.
okay, thank you.
Gentleman
So-
has withdrawn his words. There's nothing to be taken down. Gentleman will proceed.
Mr. Chairman, the point I was trying to make was there should be no rejection of collective bargaining agreements without the consent of the union. Now think about that. What that means is that the business, rather than going in and trying to convince a bankruptcy judge just to nullify the rights of the workers, the business will instead have to go to the union to say, hey, we've gotten ourselves into trouble because of very bad management decisions, and we'd like to make these adjustments. And then it becomes part of a negotiation between the management and the workers. But in any event, if we're going to continue to allow the collective bargaining agreement to be rejected and nullified, I do think that rejection damages should be entitled to the same priority that pre-petition unpaid wages and benefits are entitled to. Those damages should be able to go to the front of the line with everything else of the workers. But in general, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a major step forward to deal with a huge problem in our economy, where you get businessmen like Donald Trump repeatedly engaging in bankruptcies, which is factually grounded material, time after time again, are able to make off with millions of dollars, but the workers themselves are left empty-handed, along with a lot of small business people like carpenters and plumbers and small business contractors, painters who are left holding the bag, and which is why you can go to a website which has thousands of lawsuits that have been brought against Mr. Trump for failure to pay his workers and failure to pay the small businesses that he deals with. And I'm sorry if there was any misunderstanding before about my general description of people who engage in predatory and deceptive behavior as con men. But I certainly wasn't referring that directly to the President of the United States. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I'd first of all like to associate myself with the gentlelady from Arizona, who I think made some very good points. This committee is a serious committee that deals with serious issues that are supposed to benefit the American people. Today, we're talking about bankruptcy and trying to improve the laws relative to bankruptcy in this country. That is a federal issue dealt with at the federal level, so it's appropriate for us to deal with that. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to engage in gratuitous attacks on the president, even breaking the rules of this committee, although those remarks were withdrawn. I appreciate the gentleman withdrawing those remarks. I also appreciate the gentleman from Arizona noting that, because there's certain decorum that's supposed to take place in this committee. But today it's attack the president on bankruptcy laws is apparently what they're doing. They're so politicizing this hearing, they ought to move this hearing perhaps from this room down to the DCCC headquarters down the street. Down there, they could completely and utterly politicize this and attack the president even more so. And if you're going to attack him on bankruptcy, why don't you at least talk about how he benefited an awful lot of the American people by making it necessary for them not to file bankruptcy, by working with Congress to pass policies that actually benefited so many people in this country that we had record low unemployment until COVID hit, obviously, and was a gut punch to the entire American economy and everybody who lives in this country and all over the world for that matter. And of course, they've attacked him on that as well. But because of the policies that this Congress passed and the president signed and worked with us, things like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which my colleagues on the other side continued to misportray as something that only went to the rich. It was just tax cuts for the rich, when 85% of Americans got their taxes
reduced. In my district, for example, I represent the greater Cincinnati area, 1st District of Ohio. The average family in my district got about $2,400 cut from their taxes. That was money that they could use for educating their kids, for putting clothing on themselves, for maybe taking a vacation, maybe upgrading their car. $2,400 is a lot of money to a lot of Americans, and the policies that this president worked with this Congress to pass benefited an awful lot of people. Fewer people, were in a position where they had to file bankruptcy because they had more money in their pockets, and he also worked with us to reduce regulations. And the combination of those two resulted in lower unemployment, and unemployment is directly related to bankruptcy for an awful lot of folks. So a lot of advancements were made. And when one considers that the economy and the state of the economy at that time, we had record low unemployment on virtually all Americans, but in certain categories, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, it literally was at historic lows. So if you're going to attack the president gratuitously time and time again here relative to bankruptcy, at least give him some credit for being involved in helping to make this the best economy that we'd seen for a long, long time. Obviously, COVID came along and that changed a lot of that. But because of this Congress working together in a bipartisan manner, passing the CARES Act, for example, which the PPP was in there, saved small businesses all across the country. About 50 million jobs were saved because of the CARES Act. The president signed it. I was at the signing ceremony down the Oval Office that day. Within a week, the SBA was putting out loans which literally saved the economy, a lot of small businesses. And I happen to be the ranking member of the House Small Business Committee, work with Nydia Velasquez, the Democratic chair of that committee. In that committee, we worked together in a bipartisan manner. I wish this committee worked more together in a bipartisan manner, but it's certainly not bipartisanship when one continues to take gratuitous attacks at this president. I would advise that we work together. We'd be a better committee, and we'd be able to implement policies that would be a lot better off for the country. And that's what we ought to be about here. So I said I wasn't going to talk too long. Unfortunately, took up the 5 minutes there. But since my time's up, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. For reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 7370 is amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed,
Aye.
no.
Aye.
The ayes have it.
No.
The bill,
Mr. Chairman, I request a roll call.
recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
I'm trying to figure out how to turn my calendar.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
I don't know.
Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
I thought you were going to be
Mr.
here.
Johnson of Georgia
of
votes
Georgia.
aye. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass, can you please turn on your camera?
I'm trying to. I can't figure it out. I'm sorry. Hey, there I am. See me now?
Ms. Bass?
You see me?
Yes. How do you vote?
Aye. Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Correa, aye.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat?
No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Collins? Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Ms. Roby? Mr. Gaetz? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe?
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 20 ayes and 10 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2648, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2019, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2648 to provide bankruptcy relief for student borrowers.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 2648, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2019, addresses head-on the manifest unfairness that student loans, unlike every other unsecured debt, such as credit cards or auto loans, are effectively non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. We are in the midst of a growing crisis. Nearly 45 million Americans owe nearly $1.5 trillion of student loan debt, an amount that exceeds all outstanding credit card and auto loan debt combined. That amount has tripled since 2006. It will grow to $2 trillion just 2 years from now. Some people may like to think of student loan debt as a problem for the young, but that falsehood is belied by the data and by the experience of millions of adults and retirees still struggling to manage the student loans they took out decades ago. Today, there are 15.5 million people with student loan debt aged 40 or older, including 8.4 million people aged 50 or older and 3.2 million people over the age of 60. According to the Federal Reserve, today people aged 50 or over have more than $260 billion student loan debt. According to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, more than 40% of borrowers aged 65 or older are in default on their student debt. The reality for an increasing number of senior citizens is that they will bear these debts for the rest of their lives. This crisis affects us all. It affects Black, Latino, and Native Americans more than others. Study after study has shown that minority borrowers take on more student loan debt, take longer to pay off that debt, and are more likely to fall behind or into default than white borrowers. In part, this is because they are more likely to take out predatory high-interest private loans to attend for-profit universities. One study found that these loans are so exploitative that they wipe out the long-term benefits of the education they pay for. The reality is that Americans across the nation are facing crushing student loan debt that is preventing them from increasing their incomes, purchasing homes, buying cars, getting married, and otherwise living the American dream. We must ensure that Americans are able to invest in their education and then go on to live productive lives without the growing burden of student debt pulling them down. The bankruptcy process is made for just this kind of crisis. It is an option of last resort, and the consequences of filing for bankruptcy are severe. But it also promises a fresh start so that people can get back up and on their feet and keep working and providing for their families. That promise rings hollow for many people, however, because student loans, the single largest type of consumer debt, are effectively immune from the bankruptcy process. Under current law, educational debt can only be discharged in bankruptcy if the borrower demonstrates that continued repayment of the debt would impose a, quote, undue hardship on the debtor and the debtor's dependents. In practice, the standard has proven a nearly impossible hurdle to overcome in the courts. There is no reason that this one category of debt should be singled out for special treatment that makes relief under the Bankruptcy Code virtually impossible. This legislation, therefore, would repeal the current limitation on educational debt and would place it on the same footing for bankruptcy purposes as other similar debt. The Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2019 would fix a great injustice that burdens millions of Americans and would strengthen our economy in the process. I thank all of my colleagues who have worked with me to fight for this legislation, including Congressman Neguse, who is a lead co-sponsor of the bill, and Congressman Cohen, who has been a champion of similar legislation to protect student debtors in bankruptcy. I urge all members to support H.R. 2648. I now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The skyrocketing cost of higher education and the enormous debt crisis facing taxpayers are serious issues that Congress should confront. But this bill is not a solution to these problems. In fact, it makes these problems worse and puts our grandchildren and future taxpayers on the hook for borrowing that is happening today. H.R. 2648 will incentivize students to borrow large sums of money, knowing they may never need to repay them. The bill will further inflate the higher education bubble and burden taxpayers with the personal debts of individuals with college and graduate level degrees. The federal government has an outsized role in the student loan industry. In fact, the federal government owns or otherwise backs approximately 90% of all student loans. This means that most student loan debt is fundamentally different than other types of debt. For example, if a person files for bankruptcy to discharge credit card debt, a business bears both the risk and the loss. But if most students today could discharge their student loans through bankruptcy, taxpayers would be stuck with that tab. That should give us all some serious pause. And this bill is not just bad for taxpayers, it also hurts students. The thought of taking out loans they must repay forces students to face the hard but important decisions, like whether college is the right choice and how that choice will build the foundation for a successful career. But under this bill, instead of planning and working in school towards securing a good job and repaying their debt, students could more easily seek forgiveness of loans through bankruptcy. In other words, this bill disincentivizes students from choosing practical degrees that will allow them to build the foundation of a solid career. And the last thing we need right now is more philosophy majors patrolling the streets in what are mostly peaceful protests. H.R. 2648 will also directly undermine existing efforts to address the higher education bubble by making current loan forgiveness and income-based repayment programs less appealing. Rather than wait 10 years and engage in public service until loans are forgiven, for example, a student could file for a quick bankruptcy right after graduation. Another way this bill will undermine existing efforts to address the higher education bubble is by making it more likely that the student choose college instead of other vocational paths, such as registered apprenticeships and the trades. This will not only hurt students, it will also widen the skills gap that America is facing. H.R. 2648 does nothing to check rising tuition costs or check universities and colleges from taking advantage of students' access to taxpayer-backed loans. If a student discharges a debt through bankruptcy, the student's alma mater will still get paid. To address the higher education bubble and problems student debt creates, we have to address the underlying cause. The federal government should not be in the business of student loans at all, especially when those loans enable countless colleges to hike tuition year after year. Instead of sticking it to taxpayers, including those taxpayers who are working hard to put themselves or their children through college without debt, are those who are actually making good on their student loan repayments, Congress should work towards real solutions. I urge opposition to this bill and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize that objection. All other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2648.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment simply modifies the title of the bill to the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2020 and makes no substantive changes to the bill. I urge all members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
First, let me thank you. Thank you. First, let me thank you for your leadership on any number of these bills, and as well, my colleagues. If there's ever a more urgent, more desperate revision of the law, appropriately, changing from 1998 when we took away this particular provision, it is now. Student Borrowers Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2020 is long overdue. I disagree with my colleague on the other side of the aisle. Frankly, I believe this legislation gives a lifeline to young people across America who just wanted to do the right thing. I hope they're listening. I know they wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to get a certificate in welding. They wanted to get an accounting degree. They wanted to be a nurse's aide. They wanted to be a nurse. They wanted to be a tech, an EMT. Maybe they wanted to go on to get a law degree, to be a teacher, to be a scientist, to be an astronaut. Young as they were, many of them already independent, sought opportunities to do the right thing. But unscrupulous institutions took advantage of them. I see them all the time. The Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2019, which, like other forms of consumer credit, would make all student loan debt dischargeable in bankruptcy by repealing from the Bankruptcy Code Section 52388, which currently prohibits educational debt from being discharged unless the debtor demonstrates that continued repayment of the debt would impose an undue hardship on the debtor and the debtor's dependents. I can assure you, I've seen these students. It represents an undue debt, and it has stopped them from buying homes, from getting a job, from carrying on with their life, from being a contributing American. Especially for individuals and their families, the fundamental promise of American bankruptcy is a fresh start. Do you not think that a 22-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old needs a fresh start when they had good intentions? I think that is a best part of what America is. It allows them to become a contributing member of society, paying their taxes, getting work, and building their family. As the Supreme Court has repeatedly explained, a central purpose of the Bankruptcy Code is to provide a procedure by which honest but unfortunate debtors can reorder their affairs, make peace with their creditors, and enjoy a new opportunity in life with a fair field for future effort, unhampered by the pressure and discouragement and depression of pre-existing debt. The Fresh Start is animated by both principle and public policy. The power of the individual to earn a living for himself or herself and those dependent upon himself or herself is in the nature of a personal liberty quite as much, if not more, than it is a property right. These are innocent persons, not large corporations, not our president, who time after time utilize the Bankruptcy Code for mistakes made. These are persons who just simply wanted to get an education. To preserve its free exercise is of the utmost importance, not only because it is a fundamental private necessity, but because it is a matter of great public concern. That is the individual right that comes under bankruptcy. And this is for the individual, not for large corporations, which still have the right to file either under 11 or 7. The Fresh Start has been explained as an important form of insurance against complete ruin and economic second chance, which acts as a safety valve in our capitalist society that benefits both families and the broader economy. Consumer bankruptcy protection has been shown, for example, to improve families' employment, their health, and financial prospect, to reduce unemployment during a recession and contribute to the GDP growth. The Fresh Start is not a free ride. Individuals and families have two paths to go. First, Chapter 11, which allows the debtor to make a clean break. But in this instance, the second path is Chapter 13, which allows a debtor to keep her assets or his assets if she can pay off her debts and work over a 3 to 5 year period. I support this legislation because it is extremely important for a fresh start to do it right, to do it legally, and to be able to get our families back on their feet and to acknowledge that they too are part of the American dream. I know that they will not take advantage of it. I've seen them in my office, and I know all they want to do is to stand on their feet. I ask my colleagues to support this legislation and very glad to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 2648. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman will, clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2648, ordered by Mr. Tiffany of Wisconsin. Strike Section 2 and
Without
insert the
objection,
following.
the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman will speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would deny any relief under the provisions of this bill to any person who has been convicted of an offense arising out of the violent rioting and looting that has gripped too many of our communities over the last 6 months. Organized anarchist groups like Antifa have been engaging in systematic criminal activity, including assaults, widespread property damage and destruction, repeated looting, and attacks on law enforcement and others. They have devastated communities in my state, Kenosha, Madison, Milwaukee, as well as neighborhoods just over the border in Minnesota, and have left them in ruins. These are not mostly peaceful protests, as some would have you believe, and Antifa is not a myth, Mr. Chairman. These are predatory assaults on civil society and our way of life, and they are very real.
Garrett.
They are designed to spread terror and chaos, to destroy businesses, and to shake the very foundations of our country. First, it was Minneapolis and Atlanta, then Portland and Seattle, then Milwaukee, Madison, and Kenosha. Tomorrow, it could be yours.
Come in here.
Americans should not tolerate this lawlessness, and taxpayers definitely should not be funding it. Putting taxpayers on the hook to discharge the student loans of foot soldiers of Antifa and other like-minded groups who are causing all this destruction and harm to our neighborhoods makes no sense. Law-abiding taxpayers in Democrat-run cities are already being asked to bear a huge monetary and human cost associated with this anarchy. Asking them to pick up the tab for the perpetrator's student loans on top of that simply adds insult to injury. I ask for a yes vote on my amendment, and I would like to ask for a roll call, Mr. Chairman. I yield the rest of my time back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am not sure of the germaneness or the constitutionality of this amendment, but I withdraw my point of order.
The point of order is withdrawn. I'll speak in opposition to the amendment. The amendment seems completely off base. This has nothing to do with Antifa or terrorists or anything else. This is simply saying that student loan debt can be discharged in bankruptcy, or can be discharged in bankruptcy under the Bankruptcy Code. That's all it does. It has nothing to do with who has the student loan debt. Any American who has student loan debt can discharge it in bankruptcy. This is a bankruptcy amendment. It has nothing to do with Antifa or terrorists or any other individual, except every American. Every American under this bill has the ability to discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy, as we discharge many other things in bankruptcy. Period. I yield back. And I urge opposition to the amendment for the reasons I stated. For what purpose does... Who seeks recognition? Does anyone?
Mr. Chairman. Appeal the decision of the chair. I think he's trying to get your attention.
There is no decision to appeal.
Did you not just make a decision that it's not germane?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I withdraw.
Mr. Chair,
Who seeks recognition?
it's Congresswoman Debbie Lesko from Arizona.
For what purpose does Ms. Lesko seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully disagree with your assertion that it's not related at all. I think the amendment, if I'm not mistaken, from Congressman Tiffany was that if someone is convicted of the rioting and looting that has taken place, and their loan should not be forgiven in bankruptcy. And so to me, that's totally relevant. I don't want taxpayer dollars going to someone who is convicted of rioting and looting in our cities. And so therefore I support his amendment and I yield back.
Chairman,
The gentlelady yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr.
For what
Chairman,
purpose does Ms. Lofgren seek recognition?
to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I strongly support this legislation, which is overdue, and believe, as you do, that student loan debt shouldn't be treated differently from other debts in bankruptcy. I think it's worth pointing out that prior to 1976, both federal and private student loans were dischargeable through bankruptcy, so this is nothing new. It's not a free ride or an easy way out from debt for those who don't really need it. And for those of us who were on the committee when Henry Hyde chaired the committee, we recall very well, I'm sure, the provisions put into the code that make it very difficult for individuals to qualify for bankruptcy relief. Student loans shouldn't be a life sentence of debt, and for those who have no realistic path to repaying them, bankruptcy should provide a path to a fresh start. Now, I oppose the amendment that's been offered. I think it's an opportunity or an effort to change the subject because the scale of student loan debt in the United States is simply breathtaking. An estimated 44 million Americans have student loan debt. It's more than 1 out of 6 American adults. The student loan debt in the U.S. is approximately $1.6 trillion. For the class of 2019, 69% of college students took out loans, graduating with an average debt of nearly $30,000. Now, student debt is becoming a crushing burden during the pandemic and economic crisis. Even before the pandemic, 10% of student loans are already more than 90 days delinquent, according to the New York Fed. And with at least 50 million unemployment filings since March, many more Americans will be unable to pay their student loans. Other student loan relief programs during the pandemic, such as forbearance or partial forgiveness, have provided some immediate help, but they're only temporary or partial fixes. More than ever, we need to allow student debt relief through bankruptcy. I think that the amendment is trying to give an excuse why people would not support this necessary measure, because Americans who are just being crushed by this debt and faced with a Department of Education that absolutely refuses to engage in forbearance or partial forgiveness provisions based on the emergency provisions that are already in the code, those Americans are being crushed. They're not able to buy houses. They're postponing marriage and family
The gentlelady
life.
yield.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
As I understand it, and I just want you to confirm it, this bill would simply restore the law as it was prior to the amendments of 2005, when student debt was dischargeable in bankruptcy. That was the normal practice. It was changed, unfortunately, in 2005. No one talked in those days about Antifa or anything else. Simply, student debt was dischargeable in bankruptcy, and all we're seeking to do is to restore that situation, correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman, and it's long overdue. As I mentioned, in that revision of the bankruptcy code, the eligibility for bankruptcy relief was enormously strengthened. It is very difficult to become eligible for bankruptcy, and I'm sure you recall, Mr. Chairman, because you and I were both members of the committee, the stringent requirements imposed on the debtor who enters into bankruptcy relief. It is not a piece of cake. So, many have talked in the country about how do we provide relief for the crushing burden of student debt. An obvious way is this bill, because we have a screen for those who are really in need, and that's the Bankruptcy Code and the bankruptcy provisions. So this is no giveaway. This is an opportunity to provide relief to those in need. And not only will it help those individuals who have been crushed by debt, it will help our country, because we need these graduates, these students, to be able to live a full and productive life and not spend the next several decades of their life crushed under debt and not doing all of the things that our country needs them to do, to form families, to have children, to buy a house, to live the full life that America provides. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this amendment should be rejected for the
Ms.
Mr.
Lofgren,
Chairman?
we can't hear you, ma'am.
For what purpose does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition? Oh, what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield my time to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. So I heard a few things here after I presented this amendment. And one, there was a question of germaneness. Clearly, this is germane. I also heard, with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, you said this amendment has nothing to do with student loans, and also that this is an excuse to derail this bill. This amendment has nothing to do with all of those things. This is really important to the American people. And I understand why some people on this committee feel very uncomfortable with this amendment, because you know what? A whole lot of people around the country, including in my state, have been awfully uncomfortable watching riots in their streets. And I think about the footage that was run in Madison, Wisconsin during the State Street riots, and the riots that ensued a couple weeks later when our governor and the mayor of Madison did nothing to protect the communities of the community of Madison. And what we saw in some instances were many young people who may very well have graduated, for example, from UW-Madison, that were destroying businesses on State Street, one of the most iconic streets that you'll find in the state of Wisconsin, tearing down the statue of Hans Christian Heg, an abolitionist soldier who gave his life at Chickamauga for the Union, to protect the Union, and to end slavery. Lady Forward, torn down in front of the state capitol in Madison. Lady Forward, celebrating Wisconsin being the first state to ratify women's suffrage. Though there were a lot of young people that were participating in that. And the people of this country, and I know certainly of the state of Wisconsin, they would not want to discharge the debts of people like that that are choosing anarchy and destruction. I believe this amendment is germane, and I hope all members of this committee will vote for it. I yield my time back.
For what purpose does Mrs. Cicilline seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I had to step out of the room for a moment when the bill was called up, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2019, and when I came back in just a few minutes later, I thought for a moment I'd gone into the wrong room because there was a discussion about Antifa and looting, and so I was struggling with it. So let's not allow this effort to distract from this really important piece of legislation. There are literally veterans with diabetic paralysis who are lying in bed, who have been able to discharge all of their other debt in bankruptcy with one exception, student loan debt. There are people who are receiving Social Security who are having their Social Security checks attached because they can discharge all their other debt but this. This is what the bill is designed to address. H.R. 2648, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act, would provide relief from crushing student loan debt for economically distressed individuals who have no alternative but filing for bankruptcy. The overriding principle of the bankruptcy system is to give people who are overwhelmed with unmanageable debt a fresh start through meaningful relief from their debt. The system is supposed to work for everyone, from consumer debtors and small business owners to student borrowers, and give them a new pathway to economic prosperity. But it is all too clear the bankruptcy system is not working. Today, far too many student loan borrowers have been unable to succeed financially due to overwhelming student loan debt. The amount of outstanding debt has skyrocketed to nearly $1.6 trillion. According to the Federal Reserve, this amount has tripled since 2006 and is expected to grow to $2 trillion in the next few years. And while many borrowers attempt to pay off these loans, over 11% of student loan debt was in default or seriously delinquent at the end of 2018, the highest delinquency rate among types of consumer loans tracked by the New York Fed. In addition to undermining the quality of life and the earning of borrowers, this crisis has also severely affected the economy overall. The American Bankruptcy Institute reports that student loan debt has undermined home ownership, automobile ownership, and has also resulted in a decline in students choosing public service careers over the private sector. As this report notes, and I quote, student loan debt thus affects not only those who owe the loans, but also has consequences that ripple through our communities and our nation, end quote. This grotesque outcome is due to outdated provisions in the Bankruptcy Code that have made educational debt virtually non-dischargeable, with no good reason, incidentally. Under current law, student borrowers cannot discharge this debt unless they demonstrate that they would face an undue hardship if the debt is not discharged. While Congress intended that provision to provide relief for hard-hit borrowers, in practice, it is an extremely high bar to relief for those with crushing debt. H.R. 2648, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act of 2019, would fix this problem by ensuring that student loan debt is treated the same as almost every other form of debt that can be discharged in bankruptcy. As an original co-sponsor of this important bill, I applaud Chairman Nadler and Senator Durbin for their leadership on H.R. 2648, and I urge my colleagues to support this overdue measure. And when you have constituents, as we all do, who are facing the devastating consequences of being unable to discharge this debt, they expect us to take action in a serious way. That's what this bill does. I urge my colleagues to focus on what this bill the problem it attempts to solve, do something about it, and don't look for an excuse to vote against the millions of student borrowers who are facing this kind of debt by voting no. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Gaetz seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I support Mr. Tiffany's amendment. The underlying piece of legislation that would allow students to discharge student loan debt through bankruptcy would shatter the foundation of higher education finance. It would create a dramatic and sudden shift in the pricing of higher education. It would disrupt almost every university budget in America. And that's exactly why I'm voting for it. During my adult life, prices in higher education have skyrocketed. University administration budgets have exploded. Administrators have gotten rich while a generation of students have been relegated to a life of indentured servitude. 44 million Americans dealing with crushing student loan debt, an amount in the aggregate that exceeds $1.6 trillion. That's more than the amount of money Americans have bought against or borrowed against cars. That's more than America's credit card debt in the aggregate. And it has impacted the life of so many of my fellow millennials. Unable to get married, unable to have a down payment for a home. It's almost like in dating, in millennial life, and in marriage, student loan debt is like the reverse dowry. You're not just marrying someone, you're quite literally marrying their student loan debt as well. It's had an impact on the American family, on the economy, and we should do something about it. But it does raise the question, how did we get here? Why in 2005, as the chairman correctly referenced, did members of Congress and the Senate abandon young people in this country and sell out their promise and their future? And in some research, it appears I've found the answer to that question. I'd like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a publication by The Guardian entitled how Biden helped create the student debt problem he now promises to fix.
Without objection.
And in this article, it's talking about 18 senators who abandoned the Democrat position and joined with Republicans, and it reads, 18 Democrat senators breaking ranks and casting their vote in favor of the bill. Of those 18, one politician stood out as an especially enthusiastic champion of the credit companies who, as it happens, had given him hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions. Joe Biden. And that sentiment, the linkage of these problematic campaign donations in exchange for voting against young people and students, is also reflected in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the piece entitled, How Joe Biden Helped Inflame the Student Loan Debt Crisis.
Without objection, would the gentleman yield?
I have a few more points to get through and then be honored to. And in this piece, I think the comments of Senator Russ Feingold are particularly noteworthy, where he said the bankruptcy bill was a poster child for the need for campaign finance reform. So Joe Biden taking donations and then turning around and voting against students. The evidence continues with a piece from the Sept, and this is entitled, Joe Biden's Role in Creating the Student Debt Crisis Stretches Back to the 1970s. And I'd seek unanimous consent to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
And it says here, what Biden is forced to respond to this on the campaign trail, and he says, I don't think you should be paying for my son Hunter to go to Yale Law School. On that point, I may agree with him. I don't think you should be paying for my daughter Ashley to go to the University of Pennsylvania. That response, when confronted with his record selling out to the creditors and to the lenders, shows a fundamental misunderstanding with what the majority is trying to do, which I support on this committee. But last but most certainly not least, my favorite writing on Joe Biden's role in this is a Harvard Law School piece by Elizabeth Warren entitled, What is a Women's Issue, Bankruptcy, Commercial Law, and Other Gender-Neutral Topics. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter that into the record. And in this piece, I think particularly noteworthy is where Senator Warren says, missing, for example, is a picture of Senator Biden standing shoulder to shoulder with the CEOs of the credit industry co-sponsoring legislation to increase restrictions on consumer and small business bankruptcy. It appears as though Joe Biden was the student loan indebtedness senator. And I'm grateful that the majority on this committee wants to break away from the Biden record on student loans and would instead chart a way forward that is more fair to America's young people. I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The gentleman is quite correct. At the time, which was 2005, there was an attempt to do exactly what was done. It was the wrong thing to do. Senator Biden was on the wrong side. Many people in both parties were on the wrong side. Senator Warren was then a Harvard law professor who was advising me. I was one of the leaders of the opposition, and hopefully everybody has learned from that. But you're quite right. People were wrong at the time. But I appreciate your support for this. It is the right thing to do. It was the wrong thing to do then. It was the right thing to do now.
I agree. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose?
Move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was about to say the same thing to my colleague from Florida. I think many of us have raised some of those points before, and I'm so pleased that you are voting for the bill. And I believe that we have moved a lot of people to the right place, and unfortunately, it took too long. I am a proud co-sponsor of this bill, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act, to restore justice to student borrowers who are struggling the most. Our nation has a student debt crisis that oppresses young people of color, low-income and middle-income families, shuffling them out of the benefits that American higher education can and should offer to everyone. Over 45 million Americans collectively hold a total of $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. That is more than total U.S. credit card debt. And that figure is projected to swell to $2 trillion by 2022. Even before the COVID-19 crisis hit, nearly 1 in 4 student borrowers were behind on their payments, making it impossible for them to buy a house or to start a family, much less to think about actually getting that education. Now, 10 million student loan borrowers could be out of work amid the recession associated with this pandemic. And yet, at the end of this year, borrowers with federal student loans may have to go back to making monthly payments again because Republicans today are refusing to negotiate with us to extend the payment pause or provide any additional relief beyond what was granted in the CARES Act. What's more, people with private student loans received absolutely no relief from their monthly payments. Student borrowers are becoming more and more desperate, and while no one ever wants to file for bankruptcy, in some cases it can provide people with mountains of debt a pathway to restore their financial stability. Nearly every form of debt can be eliminated through the bankruptcy process, including credit card debt and medical debt, but not student debt, except in extremely rare cases, and that is just unfair. What's more, when big businesses fall on hard times, they can take advantage of the relief that bankruptcy offers. They can eliminate debts owed to creditors, reorganize, and spring back, refreshed, renewed, and ready for a second or third chance. In fact, our president has taken advantage of this quite a few times. But when normal people with student loan debt fall on hard times, they have no opportunity to seek the same relief. This legislation that we're voting on today is so important because it would reverse this injustice. For the first time in over 40 years, student loans would be treated like nearly all other forms of unsecured debt. For those student borrowers who have no realistic path to pay back their crushing student loan debt, this would give them an option to help them get back on their feet. My Republican colleagues may argue that people who have the means to repay their student debts must do so. But we are talking here about those who do not have the means. Think about the young woman who is the first in her family to go to college. She works part-time throughout college, but she still has to take out loans to afford the ballooning cost of higher education in this country. After years of making on-time payments, she gets unlucky. Her kid is diagnosed with cancer, or a wildfire destroys her home, or she loses her job due to corporate downsizing. Shouldn't she have the same access to relief as big corporations? This bill is critically important, and I'm proud to be voting in favor of it today. But I also believe we have to go farther to truly address the severity of this student debt crisis, especially with the class of 2020 graduating into the worst job market since the Great Depression. And that's why I've introduced the College for All Act to do right by our young people and make public universities free and allow people to refinance their debt. And that's also why I support Representative Omar's Student Debt Cancellation Act to cancel all federal and private student loans taken out since 1965 within 6 months of the bill being signed into law. And economists have looked at that bill and seen how much it will actually jumpstart our economy to get this debt out. We need to be looking at serious, bold solutions to address the severity of our student debt crisis. Eliminating student loans in bankruptcy is a critical first step, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Armstrong seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I agree with just about everything my friend from Florida said, other than that voting for this bill will have that outcome. And the reason is I have a little more, it's either faith or cynicism, I'm not sure which, in how institutions and how this will work. Cost of higher education's gone up by about 25% over the last decade. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. There's cost of living, there's cost of compliance, but the two most important things, which this bill does nothing to address, is cuts to higher education at the state level and the overinflated bureaucracy that exists in administrations. Because I do know this, that 25% increase hasn't been delivered to professors and it hasn't been delivered to students. And without dealing with those core issues, this bill will continue to exacerbate the problem, because there is nothing in here that will incentivize a college to reduce their tuition increases. And without doing those things, we are going to continue to see that. And when you know that you can discharge, when you can discharge those student loans, we also have to run into the nuances of who is getting these loans. Every kid in this country who wants a higher education deserves to get one. One of the reasons that occurs is because of how student loans exist. And there are lots of problems with this, and I believe it is a crisis that that is coming home and we are facing. But by simply just by allowing these discharge or forgiveness of student loans without putting any guardrails on the cost of higher education or how that occurs, there are a lot of people that make decisions to forego a high tuition a high tuition university for a lower tuition university. There are a lot of people, earlier it was mentioned about welding and accounting, but even in this job market and where we're at, those types of jobs tend to work forward. We don't make any distinctions about which ones of these things we deal with or how we deal with them. All we do is go to the lowest common denominator. But there's nothing in this bill that ensures that we will hold the cost of higher tuition increase. And as we continue to move forward this, I think what ends up really happening is the people we're most trying to help, we are going to hurt. And so, do you want some time?
Yeah, well, the gentleman.
Absolutely.
For a colloquy. So if students are able to discharge, I see what you're saying, that the bill doesn't say bureaucracy has to be cut. But if students can discharge their debt through bankruptcy, then there will be fewer of those loans issued, right? Because if they're risky loans, they won't be issued. And so universities won't be able to charge as much, tuition will go down, and because they won't be able to charge as much, they won't be able to have a, senior provost of intersectional gender studies knocking down $280,000 a year while somebody's just trying to pay tuition for their family member.
Well, I think
I yield back.
Well, I think there's two fundamental problems with that. One is that every 85% or whatever the number is backed by the federal government. And two, I think the easiest way in which you get to lower risk loans is ability to repay the loan, more so than where you're at, which is going to immediately go where we've been trying to get away from for a very, very long time. And what I mean by that is people who can afford the loan are going to get the loan. People who can't afford the loan aren't going to get the loan. And I don't think we deal with that nearly enough because.
But would the gentleman concede that the inability to get the loan would then be linked to the quality of the higher education product delivered, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that even poor kids are going to be able to get a student loan for quantum computing and, advanced microbiology. It's like where you've got people who are getting graduating with $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in debt that walk out with my degree, the political science degree, and then are far less employable. Don't you think that the chairman's bill would create some market forces that don't currently exist within higher education? And I agree with you on the point of federally backed loans. I would support that too.
And I think that's part of the problem. And I don't disagree with anything you said. I actually don't disagree with a lot of what my colleagues on the other side have said about this. I have a different take on how that actually will occur, so.
For what purpose does Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
And I'm so grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, and also Congressman Katko for introducing this important bipartisan legislation, and I really am happy to say it's bipartisan. I do have to say, though, that I oppose the amendment and I support the bill because so many in our country are facing great financial uncertainty and hardship as we continue to persevere through this pandemic. Many Georgians in my own state have worked hard to improve their prospects through education with help of student loans. They've gotten college degrees and even graduate degrees in hopes of providing a strong economic foundation for their families and for their futures. And for many, this investment in their future pays dividends. And over a period of time, many of them are able to pay back those student loans. Unfortunately, others will find themselves in periods of great financial difficulty, such as what we have right now under the pandemic. Under such a strain, bankruptcy can provide a way forward, a way out of debt, and toward a more hopeful future, a new beginning for these people, and also in building their futures. And this bill helps those experiencing the extreme financial strain by making student loan debts dischargeable in bankruptcy, just like many other types of debt. But I have an example of something like this has happened in my district in Georgia. Argosy International defrauded many students that paid their hard-earned money to get degrees. They closed their doors, and those students have now been left with unimaginable debt, also now saddled with COVID-19. Many of them don't have jobs, they don't have resources, and may not even have a place to live. But I do want to make reference to the comments that our colleague across the aisle, Mr. Armstrong, made, the comment on the choice of study. I think the choice of study that our students take, has no bearing on whether or not they might be unfairly defrauded by for-profit institutions. and now they owe the debt that they owe for degrees and services that were not made good on by those for-profit institutions, and those doors have actually been closed to them. That's the reason why we must continue to make education more accessible, but we must also help those who have not yet reaped the benefits of their education because they have fallen on hard times or they were defrauded by these for-profit institutions. And so this bill takes an important step in providing students a bit of much-needed hope in a great moment of difficulty. And let's be real, every student in this country right now is facing extreme difficulty if they are under the gun to try to be able to pay for their education during this time. So I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Scanlon seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I want to thank the chairman for introducing and moving through committee H.R. 2648, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act, which I'm proud to co-sponsor. I look forward to supporting, and I will have to oppose the amendment. Chairman Nadler's legislation, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act, could not be more timely for my community. Pennsylvania holds the dubious distinction of having one of the highest rates of student loan debt in the nation, $68 billion. 64% of our 2019 grads have student debt with an average of $38,500 each. Even before COVID-19 upended our economy, more than 25% of Pennsylvania's student loan holders were seriously delinquent in repayment or in default. So this is an issue that hits close to home in my district. I cannot count how many constituents have told me that they've been unable to buy a home or a car, to start a family, or contribute to their children's college education because they're still paying their student loans. We have a lot of work to do to make college affordable through increased Pell Grants, increased public support for college and career education, better student loan terms, and functional student loan forgiveness programs. But the bill before us today, the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act, provides an important opportunity to make our bankruptcy code fairer to student loan borrowers who are forced to apply for bankruptcy. This bill doesn't single out student loans for special treatment or create universal student loan forgiveness. Instead, it treats student loan debt as every other form of debt, rather than giving it a special status that can survive bankruptcy and thereby continue to hang over the heads of borrowers, even when they can satisfy a court that they meet all the other conditions for bankruptcy. There is no principled reason to provide student loans with the privileged status they currently have, and doing so thwarts the purpose of our bankruptcy laws, which is to provide eligible debtors with a fresh start. There is certainly no reason why student loan borrowers should have fewer protections in bankruptcy than unscrupulous real estate developers or other con men who take advantage of our bankruptcy laws. As Americans face the worst economic and joblessness crisis in a generation, and with national student debt upwards of $1.6 trillion, avenues for relief must be made available. Again, I want to thank Chairman Nadler for bringing this legislation through markup, and I look forward to H.R. 2648 becoming law. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move in opposition to the amendment and in favor of the underlying legislation. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this legislation, and I thank Chairman Nadler for bringing it before us for markup today. For years now, people have been dying of old age, still owing the federal government for student loans they took out to try to better their lives. Even worse, private student loans don't get discharged when you die, which leaves predatory private lenders free to go after the spouses, children, and grandchildren who inherit their loved ones' unpaid student debt. It's hard for the American people to believe that my friends on the other side of the aisle stand unified in their support for a corporation's ability to bankrupt out of their pension obligations to their employees, but they oppose unanimously a student's ability to discharge their student loan debt in bankruptcy. Well, maybe not unanimously. Maybe there are a couple who support this legislation. It is bipartisan. But it's not right, Mr. Chairman, that a student tricked into taking out a loan to attend Trump University can't bankrupt out of the loan when they discover that their Trump University diploma is worth less than the paper it was written on. But yet, Mr. Chairman, corporations can go bankrupt and forever avoid their obligation to pay their share of their employees' pensions. And they do that with impunity. It's not right. And then to hear my friends on the other side of the aisle cry out in anguish about the impact of a student discharging student loan debt in bankruptcy and that falling on the taxpayers. But when corporations leave taxpayers holding the bag when they discharge their pension obligations, it is perfectly fine with them, because I guess it's okay when a self-proclaimed billionaire like Donald Trump only pays $750 in income taxes. Education is more expensive today than it has ever been before. According to the U.S. Department of Education, between 1992 and 2012, the average amount owed by a typical student loan borrower who graduated with a bachelor's degree was more than double, to a total of nearly $27,000. Not to mention the out-of-control cost increases by the private for-profit college racket. When Trump was forced to settle the fraud complaint against Trump University for $25 million shortly after he took office as president, it enabled 7,000 defrauded students to get back $35,000 apiece. So tuition is expensive. And as the cost rises, the opportunity to go to college or graduate school has become increasingly reserved for the wealthier in our society. For some, their families were lucky enough to be able to save enough to pay for school, but others are left with the weight of deciding whether to take out loans or skip higher learning to bet against their futures or jeopardize their career prospects. Yes, academic scholarships can cover some of the financial burden, but these scholarships are hard to get, and they are rarely enough to prevent students from having to take out loans to cover the full cost. I know this burden is not taken on lightly, and graduates take pride in paying off their loans, but a few wrong turns, like a recession, an illness, or a layoff, can cause loans to snowball, making them impossible to pay down. So bankruptcy has always been a last resort for Americans who've fallen on bad times. It's something that is not taken lightly. Unlike big corporations, Americans wait as long as they can before filing for bankruptcy. By allowing student loans to be discharged in bankruptcy, this bill would help those few who need to restart, who need this final lifeline to get their lives back. So let's do that for the people. We coddle the corporations. Let's pay some attention to the people, especially the least of these. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield my time to Mr. Armstrong.
The gentleman yields to Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you. Just a couple points here. Over 90% of the student loans are federally backed. A private, regardless of where you're at, the private for-profit universities is not how we got into this crisis. And this is homegrown at the University of North Dakota State University, Harvard, not Harvard, but University of Michigan, all across the country. And so to keep using that straw man is disingenuous and is not getting to the root of the problem, which is, it's not that I don't agree that this is coming to be a crisis. It's a part of the solution. But the other thing I want to just say, and this is to my colleague, Ms. McBath, we understand that, but if you are taking out $120,000, I'll use myself as an example because I have an undergraduate psychology degree. If I wouldn't have went to law school and decided not to go to school, an undergrad psychology degree without a graduate study essentially qualifies you to do what I did in college, which was bartend, which was the best job I ever had. But if you're going to a high-end university taking $80,000 to $100,000 a year for a loan into a degree field that doesn't pay that kind of money, it is not just bad circumstances that can put you into these kinds of troubles. Combined with, this bill does nothing to hold any guardrails either on the increase of tuition or the lack of funding from states who do this. So without some of those guardrails in place, it's not that I don't have a complete sympathy for what we're trying to do. I'm just saying it's not going to accomplish it the way in which we think it is. And when talking about when we go back to unions and labor and all of those different things, by making college more attractive by the ability to discharge your loans, you actually make the trades and those types of things less attractive to go into. And as we're developing into a 21st century workforce and economy, we want to make those jobs more attractive, not less. So with that, I will yield back to my friend, Mr. Johnson.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will, sure.
I guess the question I have for my distinguished friend from North Dakota, with whom we often agree, unfortunately disagree on this particular subject, is, so it is his position that there are prospective students out there who are going to decide whether or not to pursue an apprenticeship versus a liberal arts degree that may cost them, upwards of $100,000, based solely on the fact that they can file for bankruptcy years from now, if in fact they are unable to pay that debt. Is that's why you oppose this bill?
No, at the macro level, that's not what I'm talking about. Or at the micro level, that's not what I'm talking about. But making college overall generally more attractive chases people out of those types of things. Listen, I grew up in the age where everybody, my parents' generation grew up where everybody needed a high school degree. I grew up in the age where everybody needed a college degree. And those conversations need to start occurring in a different way. But there's no doubt that when you do something like this there's two things that happen here. We do nothing about decreasing the cost of higher education, and it makes it easier and more attractive for students to go to higher education. And that is actually true. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Again, I'm saying I want anybody who wants to go to college to be able to go to college. But I think we should be realistic about what choices they make and make those choices available for certain people.
Thank you both, gentlemen. It's a fascinating discussion. I think it's an important issue. And I would just note here that it's one that we need to talk about further. In our group, the Republican Study Committee, we released a report last week, the American Worker Report, where we talk about a lot of policy recommendations to break this bachelor's or bust mentality that I think is contributing to a lot of these problems. But this is a thoughtful discussion, and I just want to go on record once more in the few seconds I have remaining to support this amendment, because I think it makes good sense, and I think if we polled the American people, I think most people would agree. If somebody's going to engage in lawlessness and tear down a community, they should not be have the benefit of the government's assistance further down the road. So it gives people something to think about. I strongly support the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Be happy.
Would the gentleman yield?
Be happy
to. Yeah, I have a question for the author of the amendment. Does it apply to the right-wing thugs like Mr. Rittenhouse, who go to these rallies and disrupt the peaceful demonstrations?
I'll yield to Ms. Tiffany to answer, but I'll tell you that my vote would be for all thugs. I think we ought to punish them all. I'll yield to Ms. Tiffany. You want to answer that?
Yeah, thank you. Anyone that commits lawlessness in the streets, they should, if they're looking to get their loans discharged and they're convicted of rioting and looting, they should not receive that benefit from the taxpayers of the United States of America.
Well said.
The gentleman's time is expired. The gentleman's time is expired. The gentleman's time is expired. For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment and in support of the underlying legislation, H.R. 2648. And I do that as someone who taught at a university for 10 years, also as a mother to college students. Student loan debt in America passed the $1.5 trillion mark this year. In my home state of Pennsylvania, as my good colleague has talked about, there are 1.8 million people who have collective $60 million in student loan debt. In the past few decades, We sold the American people a dream. If you go to college, you'll be able to get a good-paying job and join our country's storied middle class. The reality is alarmingly different. The cost of a college education continually increases, wages have been stagnant, the job market has experienced enormous shocks, both in the Great Recession and now during the COVID-19 pandemic. The class of 2018 was graduated with an average student loan debt of more than $29,000. And we know that the largest concentration of student loan debt, over $620 billion, is among young Americans under the age of 34. Is it any wonder, then, that marriage rates are down, home ownership is down, childbirth rates are down? Our economy is de-incentivizing the American dream with the burden of debt. Now, no one is saying that student loan debt is the sole cause, but it is undoubtedly a crisis and a significant factor in the malaise sweeping our middle class. I am a former college professor. I'm proud to co-sponsor Chairman Nadler's Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act. Making student loan debt dischargeable in bankruptcy will not solve our country's problem with the cost of education, but it provides a measure of relief to those most harmed by this crisis. In the end, I'd also like to address the contents of this amendment, which I find extraordinarily puzzling. Why don't we focus on the matter at hand? Giving Americans the ability to pursue an education without facing debilitating financial burden. Education is important for so many reasons, but particularly for our civic life, for the health of our democracy. As we have seen in the past few years with the March for Our Lives, the civic response at airports following the extraordinary Muslim ban, or most poignantly in racial justice protests that were so shockingly disrupted at Lafayette Square by this administration and agents of this administration. We should be making it easier for Americans to learn, to grow, and to become civic-minded, contributing members of our society. I look forward to voting for this bill, continue to work with urgency with my colleagues, and I urge a yes vote on the bill and no vote on the amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Negussi seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, for your leadership and for bringing the Student Borrower Bankruptcy Relief Act bill that I'm proud to co-lead with you to Markup today. And I also want to express my thanks to Congressman Katko, as well as, of course, Senators Warren and Durbin, who are leading the bill in the Senate. It's undeniable, and I think my colleague from Pennsylvania did a terrific job articulating that we have a student loan debt crisis in this country, with nearly 45 million Americans, including more than 700,000 Coloradans, shouldering $1.5 million in student debt. We must, in my view, take immediate action to help lessen the immense burden. For too many Americans, far too many, rather, Americans are defaulting on student loans, nearly 1 million borrowers every year, as student loan debt becomes the fastest growing source of household debt in the United States. And this isn't just a problem that affects young people. The burden is not on one generation, nor is it an issue for one portion of the population. It is multi-generational, impacting all demographics and in every corner of our country. And certainly that's the case in Colorado, where 1 in every 4 middle-aged Coloradans and nearly half of all young adults in my state owe student debt. The greatest hardship is felt, of course, in rural Colorado, with more than 130,000 individuals owing student loan debt. And one reason for this crisis, as has been articulated during today's markup, is in our bankruptcy system. Prior to 1976, as Chairwoman Lofgren articulated, federal and private student loan debt were both fully dischargeable in bankruptcy. And yet, over the last several decades, Congress and the courts have steadily narrowed the grounds for borrowers to gain relief from student debt in bankruptcy proceedings. I must confess, I am puzzled by the objections from some of my Republican colleagues today with respect to this bill. I understand the sentiments regarding wanting to lower the tuition at our public colleges and universities, and I certainly worked with my Republican colleagues on the Board of Regents at the University of Colorado to do precisely that. But the notion that providing this option to students who are underwater with respect to their student loan debt to be able to pursue this option in bankruptcy somehow is going to incentivize folks to take out massive amounts of student loans only to then reap the negative consequences associated with filing for bankruptcy. Filing for bankruptcy is not something that anybody wants to do. It's not something that anyone encourages. It has negative repercussions in terms of your potential employment, your credit score, and so many other potential consequences. So that to me is a farcical argument. And, with respect, I would suggest that this is a bill that everyone should be able to get behind. And of course, that is reflected in the fact that in addition to Chairman Nadler, Representative Katko, a Republican from the other side of the aisle, is co-leading this measure. So I would hope that we could put politics aside. Let's restore the law back to what it was for the better part of 40 years and give folks the opportunity, to the extent that they find themselves in such dire circumstances as needing to pursue relief under our bankruptcy laws, to be able to do that. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. Raskin seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise in very strong support of the legislation to treat student loan debt as dischargeable, just like most every other form of consumer debt, and just the way it was treated until 1976. You can achieve bankruptcy protection for business debts, for credit card debts, for medical debts, even gambling debts. But student loan debt is non-dischargeable, along with a handful of other categories like money that you're forced to pay to a court for criminal restitution or child support or alimony. So I don't really understand the whole idea of stigmatizing millions of young people who want to go to college, better themselves, join the middle class, and meet the American dream. And instead, what we get is rhetoric that we're like incentivizing young people to go out and study things they shouldn't study, or to go beyond their limitations, to go to college when they really shouldn't be in college. I'm just shocked at some of the rhetoric we're getting. I'm also baffled, my colleagues are baffled by the response of some of our GOP friends to this whole matter. I mean, they seem to be looking for somebody to scapegoat or blame. You know, if we were going to be looking for a category of people to penalize for their past activity in the bankruptcy process, why not penalize people who have filed for bankruptcy itself multiple times before? And I know they don't want to talk about Donald Trump. They don't want me to mention him. So take the president off of the picture. Imagine a con man who has nothing to do with the president of the United States. Just imagine a con man who's gone bankrupt 3 times or 4 times or 5 times and then wants to come back and seek bankruptcy protection again. And yet, no, I don't see any amendments on your part to try to deny that person the protection of the laws, even if that person pocketed millions of dollars on the way out as he or she looted the workers of a particular business. Now, there's this, I understand the amendment, let's just call it the Kyle Rittenhouse amendment, and thank you, Mr. Johnson, for getting some clarity on what we're talking about, because the amendment does say, I think it certainly covers Mr. Rittenhouse. I don't know if he inspired it, but it says you're not covered if the debtor has been convicted of an offense arising out of activity related to looting or rioting. So Mr. Rittenhouse is charged with homicide for killing 2 people with a rifle. He was only 17 years old. So as I understand it, the purpose of this amendment is to say, if Mr. Rittenhouse, say he's convicted of homicide and he goes to jail for, I don't know what it might be, 20 years or 25 years, but he's able to study some in prison and he gets out, he wants to make amends with society, he's done his time, and then he takes out loans, as I understand it, and he takes out a lot of loans, and say he goes to some phony university like Trump University, well, that's closed, but take another like for-profit university goes to, and then he gets out and he can't pay it back. And he really can't pay it back, and he's in trouble, and he goes to get the loans discharged. He can't be discharged. And I suppose, I mean, it's such an extreme set of hypotheticals that you posit to us with the Rittenhouse Amendment, Mr. Tiffany, but if you would generally say that anybody convicted of a crime, just take any ordinary criminal, Michael Flynn or Paul Manafort or Michael Stone, or, anybody, Roger Stone, anybody who's been convicted of a crime cannot achieve the benefits of bankruptcy protection, then I think you've got a more interesting case there. And I think we could debate that philosophically, but I don't know why you would target one small category of people like Kyle Rittenhouse who get into trouble because they decide to assault someone or kill people the way a lot of the Boogaloo Boys or the Proud Boys have done at these protests. By the way, here's an article I'd like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman. 51 protesters facing federal charges from the protests, yet no sign of Antifa involvement from a review of all the Department of Justice records. So they keep talking about Antifa, and I would gladly denounce Antifa. As I understand, Mr. Tiffany is denouncing today Kyle Rittenhouse and the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys. If he hasn't, I certainly hope that he will. And, but given how narrow his amendment is, I'm afraid I can't support it at this point. And I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. McCarcel policy recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. First, I oppose this amendment. I think it's a distraction and it really doesn't have much to do with this bill. I fully support this bill and I thank my colleague for working on this issue. Student debt is actually a very personal issue for me for different reasons. I've been working on student debt since I came into Congress, supporting different bills, because I spent over 13 years of my career before I came to Congress working on higher education, working here at Florida International University, which is a public university, and it serves first-generation students, and it serves the largest number of Hispanic students in the country, actually, in the entire country. And currently, just to give you an idea, the tuition and fees at FIU for a Florida, for a Miami resident at a public university is close to $24,000 right now. And it's a fact, right? We've seen these numbers that minorities, especially Latino and Black students, are hit hardest by the student loan debt crisis and student loan default. In Florida, just to give you an idea, the student loan debt has hit over $75 billion, with over 2.2 million borrowers owing an average of nearly $35,000 each. Now, more than ever, I think it's incredibly important to have a college degree to compete in this economic market. But with the rise of college tuition, including public universities, not these elite schools that people are discussing on the other side, these students are forced to take out thousands of dollars in student debt. They're unable to find gainful employment afterwards, especially right now during a pandemic, to be able to pay off these loans. Now, I know that most of the members in this committee agree that this crushing debt is preventing students, once they graduate, from purchasing their homes, providing for their families, and being able to just fulfill their dreams here. And though I do agree that filing for bankruptcy should be a last resort, and we need to make sure that we have some safeguards to that. We have to also make it available to those borrowers without a path to pay off their debt, so that they can get back on their feet. And lastly, I want to point out the hypocrisy of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. They're happy to allow major corporations to write off huge amounts of debt without protecting tens of thousands of workers. But then they're fighting to prevent students from discharging student loan debt in bankruptcy. It just makes absolutely no sense. I think that this bill is necessary. It's a good bill to support, especially during the times that we're facing currently. We owe it to the millions of students that have done all the right things just to be able to have a degree, graduate, and make a living. And I yield back.
The gentleman, the gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, no. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Are you going to do a roll call?
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Okay.
Mr. Nadler,
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes no. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa, you're on mute. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no.
Correa, no.
Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton? No. Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Mucarsel-Powell?
No.
Ms. Mucarsel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomer? Mr. Collins? Mr. Buck? Mr. Gaetz? Oh, Ms. Roby? Mr. Gaetz? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Ms. Lesko?
Aye.
Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Rechtenthaler? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes yes. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye.
Ms. Bass, how do you vote?
What are we voting?
Ms. Bass, how do you vote?
Ms. Bass, you're on mute.
Vote
Ms. Bass?
Mr. Liu, how do you vote?
no.
Mr. Liu votes no.
Ms. Escobar, how do
Did
you
you
vote?
guys hear?
Ms. Escobar votes no.
Were you able to hear me earlier?
Ms. Bass, no, we were
How did I
not.
report it? Oh, I'm sorry. I vote no.
Ms. Bass votes no.
Has everyone voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report. The clerk has to report first.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 19 noes.
Are there any further amendments? The amendment is not adopted. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If not, the question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed,
Aye.
no. In the opinion of the
No.
chair, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill HR 2648 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Can you tell me what I?
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered.
Mr. Chairman, request a roll call.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
I vote aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell? Ms. Escobar? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomer? Mr. Collins? Mr. Buck? Ms. Roby? Mr. Gaetz? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote?
Mr. Chairman, there are 7.
How am I recorded, Mr. Chairman? How am I recorded?
Ms. McCarcel-Powell, you are not recorded.
That was,
Aye, please.
Ms.
I vote
McCarcel-Powell
aye.
votes aye.
and Ms. Bass, how are you recorded?
No, she's on the phone.
Ms. Escobar?
Ms. Escobar votes aye.
Has Ms. Bass been recorded?
Yes, Ms. Bass is recorded as aye.
Okay. Is anyone else? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 5 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill is amended, is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members,
Yeah.
members will have,
happened. But
is that somebody else?
Did you, I'm sorry,
Was Ms. Bass recorded?
did you record me? I
Yes.
vote aye.
Ms. Bass was recorded as aye.
Yes.
Okay.
Members will have, the ayes have it, the bill is amended, is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 8366, the Protecting Homeowners in Bankruptcy Act of 2020, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 8366 to amend Title 11 of the United
Without
States Code.
objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 8366, the Protecting Homeowners in Bankruptcy Act of 2020, would increase the amount of home equity that homeowners and their families can protect from creditors when they are forced into bankruptcy. This simple but important change would help people stay in their homes while they engage in the hard work of emerging from financial distress. If there is one foundational principle of American bankruptcy law, it is the promise of the fresh start. As the Supreme Court has repeatedly explained, a central purpose of the Bankruptcy Code is to provide a procedure by which honest but unfortunate debtors can reorder their affairs, make peace with their creditors, and enjoy a new opportunity in life with a clear field for future effort, unhampered by the pressure and disengagement and discouragement of pre-existing debt. The Fresh Start is a quintessentially American idea. It is the promise that even when your best efforts have failed, you will have a chance to get back up and try again. It is the promise that your debts will not destroy you. We all benefit from the fresh start that bankruptcy provides. When it works as intended, it boosts economic growth, reduces unemployment, and encourages innovation and entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, the Bankruptcy Code does not always provide the fresh start it is supposed to deliver. In order to make the second chance meaningful, the Bankruptcy Code allows debtors to protect certain assets from creditors by exempting them from the bankruptcy process. These exemptions are meant to ensure that people emerge from bankruptcy with the basic necessities of life and the means to support themselves and their families. The federal homestead exemption is supposed to support the fresh start by allowing a debtor to protect a certain amount of the equity they have put into their home. This provision embodies a long-standing tradition in American law that a family's home should be protected from creditors in order to preserve the family's well-being and to promote a fresh start. But the exemption has not been amended since 1978, when it placed just $15,000 of home equity off limits to creditors. Even after indexing for inflation as provided under the law, today the homestead exemption only protects roughly $25,000 of home equity. That amount is far too low. Today, the nationwide median sales price of a home is $330,000. The median cost of a new single-wide mobile home stands at $51,000, but the current exemption protects just $25,000. If the homestead exemption is supposed to keep people in their homes, it has failed. Against this backdrop, H.R. 8366 is a step in the right direction. It would increase the federal homestead exemption to $100,000. It would allow states to use their own more generous homestead exemptions, as many already do, but it would ensure that at the very least, people will be able to provide a meaningful amount of the equity that they have put into their homes. One might ask why the number isn't higher. Why, for example, H.R. 8366 does not protect the whole $330,000 it might take to buy a home today. There are certainly compelling arguments for doing so. Texas and Florida, for example, have unlimited homestead exemptions. This bill attempts to strike a balance between allowing the states the flexibility to provide more generous exemptions and ensuring that at the very least, the federal homestead exemption will help lower-income Americans stay in their homes and will ensure that more families will have enough equity for a new home. This bill is especially important now, with so many Americans reeling from the economic fallout of the ongoing pandemic. At a time when remaining in one's home can be a matter of life or death, the importance of the homestead exemption in providing a meaningful fresh start is as clear as ever. I thank my colleague, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, for championing this bill, and I urge all members to support H.R. 8366. I now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under current law, states have the flexibility to decide whether to use federal bankruptcy exemptions or opt to develop their own. Many state legislatures have opted out of the federal exemptions. Instead of respecting these choices under our federalist system of our government, H.R. 8366 is an attempt to force all states to use a one-size-fits-all standard for one of the most important types of bankruptcy exemptions. This bill would quadruple the federal homestead exemption to $100,000 and then make that exemption apply in states that already have their own approach. That means states like West Virginia and Alabama, with median home values of less than $150,000, are treated the same as California, with a median home value of over $500,000. This is not only a deviation from federalism principles, it is also a significant change in the consequences of bankruptcy for many Americans. By increasing how much debtors can keep after bankruptcy, this bill will make it a more attractive option to file for that bankruptcy. At the same time, this bill reduces the value that creditors can recover from during bankruptcy. That means that credit will likely get more expensive to account for the increased risk, or credit may just dry up altogether. This bill is short-sighted and dangerous policy, and for those reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8366.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment simply modifies the title of Section 2 of the bill to read Federal Homestead Exemption to make clear that this addressed the federal exemption, but makes no substantive changes to the bill. I urge all members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
First, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I thank you for your leadership in these extraordinarily difficult times in this last week of session for bringing forward these important bills that will bring relief to America's families in an economic collapse that is being extraordinarily mismanaged. I thank you for your leadership for the people. The Protecting Homeowners in Bankruptcy Act increases the federal homestead exemption to $100,000. America faces an unprecedented dual public health and economic crisis because of coronavirus through no fault of their own. As we approach winter and the flu season, keeping families healthy and in their homes is a matter of utmost importance. This bill will help do that, and I hope you all will support it. COVID-19, the pandemic, has forced federal and state governments to take drastic actions. Much of the country entered into lockdowns for the months in the spring. In response to the economic downturn brought on by the virus, many states instituted foreclosure moratoriums that were more expansive than that implemented under the CARES Act. As a result, we have so far seen far fewer families lose their home than during the Great Recession. Nevertheless, with nearly more than 205,000 Americans dead from coronavirus, with winter approaching, and the case numbers on the rise, it is clear that this pandemic is far from over. As of this month, 3.7 million borrowers are still in mortgage forbearance programs. That's nearly 7% of all active mortgages. 2 million of those forbearance plans are set to expire in the coming days. The number of seriously delinquent mortgages, that's mortgages that are at least 90 days past due, doubled this summer to a 5-year high. Foreclosure rates are still historically low, but that is largely because many foreclosure moratoria are still in place. As states relax those restrictions, we may and probably will have a housing crisis on our hands. America makes us a promise to all its people that you will have a fair chance of building wealth and of protecting that wealth. And when you are in difficulty, that you will get that fresh start. This country will give you a second chance. That is the principle undergirding bankruptcy law. Those who find themselves in honest and unfortunate financial situations will have an opportunity at a fresh start. The Bankruptcy Code has a provision known as the Federal Homestead Exemption. This provision was enacted more than 4 decades ago, in 1978. It protects right now $15,000 of a home's equity from creditors. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, the median price of the American home has increased tremendously in the intervening 40 years to more than $300,000. The homestead exemption has not kept pace. I ask for my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, on behalf of your constituents who worry about their housing, their protection of their equity and their wealth as we face the fall and winter months of a pandemic. I ask all my colleagues for your support. With that, Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I ask unanimous consent to enter on the record the good Representative Mr. Cicilline's remarks. If you would offer that, if I may offer that for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition? Well, for what purpose does Mr. Cicilline seek recognition? For what purpose does Ms. Jayapal seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Dean, for introducing this important bill. Communities across the country are struggling desperately to stay housed. Over a third of people in the United States say that they're concerned that they will lose their housing if they don't get additional help to cover the cost. Losing housing has always been dangerous and destabilizing. It sets children behind in their education, disrupts people's employment, and makes it very hard for people to remain in and contribute to their communities. But now, families, elders, and people with health conditions are also subject to the additional danger of COVID. The Protecting Homeowners in Bankruptcy Act is a sensible step in the right direction. Protecting homeowners' equity is a simple and straightforward way to help homeowners who have fallen on hard times. For many people, their home is the place where they have invested their lifelong savings, and homes are often the way that wealth is passed from one generation to the next. During the Great Recession, homeowners lost trillions of dollars in wealth due to the foreclosure crisis, with the heaviest burdens on Black and Latinx homeowners. All of those slow, careful savings, all of the hope that people had for a brighter economic future for their children, all wiped out. And what's more, we saw vast swaths of homes gobbled up by private equity corporations that had no compunction about engaging in mass eviction and treating people's homes as nothing more than a source of profit. We're seeing the same trend now, with prices in my district rising at an extremely high rate, with the highest increases in prices for more affordable homes. But it does not have to be that way. Housing is a basic human need, and housing is also a basic human right. We have to protect homeowners who have fallen on difficult times, as the Protecting Homeowners in Bankruptcy Act does. We also have to recognize that things are going to get a lot worse in every single community represented in this room unless Congress invests substantial additional funds in preserving and expanding existing affordable housing and preventing eviction and foreclosure. Finally, we have to invest substantial resources to address the needs of those who are already experiencing housing instability and homelessness by investing in continuum of care and emergency service grants, as my bill, the Housing is a Human Right Act, would do. I look forward to working with my colleagues to create a world where everyone has housing. Keeping our communities housed is common sense, and it shouldn't be partisan, especially in this moment. Proposals like this bill enjoy broad support. 9 out of 10 people in a recent poll said that elected officials have to take action to ensure that everyone has access to stable and affordable housing right now. The alternative of leaving people to lose their homes is far more costly. A study released just last week on one high eviction county found that these evictions cost the public and private sector over $350 million a year in just one county. Keeping people in their homes is fiscally prudent, and it's the right thing to do. I thank my colleague, Representative Dean, for introducing this important bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does anyone seek recognition? In that case, the question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All in favor will say aye. Aye, opposed, no. The ayes have it.
Consider coming January 1,
The ayes have it.
2021.
And the amendment is agreed to. Are there any
That Dr. Sparrow and
reporting quorum being?
really appreciate if you could take a look at
Someone's phone should be on mute.
call on Congress to help prevent those.
Okay. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 8366 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye, opposed, no.
Aye.
No. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably.
Roll call.
The reported vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass, you're on mute.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demings? Ms. Demings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath? Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
Aye.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Collins? Mr. Buck? Ms. Roby? Mr. Gaetz? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Ms. Lesko?
No.
Ms. Lesko votes no.
Yeah.
Mr. Reschenthaler?
In about,
Mr. Klein?
15, 20 minutes.
Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? No. Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, you are not recorded. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to vote who haven't voted? Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? This is
Mr.
Hank
Johnson of
Johnson.
Georgia, you are not recorded.
Vote aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye.
Have we got everybody? Have we got everybody? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 18 ayes and 5 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is amended as ordered, reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.